welcome to Beyond the Knife, a medical history podcast brought to you by Surgeons Hall, Museums, Library and Archives. We are part of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh. I am Chanté, Director of Heritage and Estates at the college. Each episode, I'm joined by a guest who shares a story from the history of medicine and surgery. This episode contains discussions on topics that some people may find distressing. Please take care while listening. Crime is common, logic is rare. Therefore, it is upon the logic rather than upon the crime that you should dwell. With those words, Sherlock Holmes captures a truth born not in fiction but in the streets and halls of 19th century Edinburgh. This was a city of sharp contrasts. Grand Georgian townhouses, besides crowded tenements, science and medicine advancing in the shadow of real and often brutal violence. And it was here, long before fingerprints or DNA, that doctors began using observation, evidence, and logic to uncover the truth behind suspicious deaths and violent crimes. Their pioneering methods didn't just change justice, they inspired stories, shaped thinking, and even influenced a young student named Arthur Conan Doyle, who would turn his teacher, Dr. Joseph Bell, into the model for Sherlock Holmes. Today, we're joined by Louise Wilkie, Curator of Surgeons Hall Museums, to explore how medicine and mystery came together in Victorian Edinburgh. These are the real stories of Edinburgh's medical detectives, the cases, the people, and the science that brought medical logic into the service of law. Louise, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to start off today with our warm-up question, which is, if you could be present at any moment in the history of medicine, what would it be and why?
Well, in keeping with today's theme, I would probably go back to a moment in history involving the Jack the Ripper serial case, where apparently Henry Duncan Littlejohn and Joseph Bell, who I'll talk about today, were both called in by the London police to investigate their evidence and give their expert opinion on who the murderer was in the Jack the Ripper case. And apparently both men wrote down the name of the murderer in 2 sealed notes and sent them to London. So I'd either go back in time and look over the shoulders of both men, or look over the shoulder of the London detective who opened those envelopes.
Gosh, and those envelopes have been lost now.
As far as I'm aware, I don't know whether this is a true story or not, or whether it's one of those stories that have been retold through history, but it would be very interesting to see.
So in the Jack the Ripper case, it's a time when there is no DNA. We have no modern crime scene protocols, but we do have medical detectives.
We do.
And that's what you're here to talk to us about today.
Yes, so I'm going to talk about my interest in the medical detectives of 19th century Edinburgh and explore Arthur Conan Doyle's connection with these real-life characters during his time here in Edinburgh as a medical student, and how these unique men might have helped shape the most famous detective of all, Sherlock Holmes, and ask really just how close the world got to a real-life Sherlock Holmes.
So we find ourselves in the 1800s in Edinburgh. This is a city that is literally buzzing with people that are so excited about advancing medical knowledge. Where does Arthur Conan Doyle fit into this?
So he studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh from 1876 to 1881. And he also took classes at the Extramural School of Medicine, which was based here on the campus of the Royal College of Surgeons. He worked under one of his teachers, who was Joseph Bell, and he was also Joseph Bell's outpatient clerk at the Royal Infirmary.
Yeah, of course. So we have in the archives here at the college a lot of material relating to both Bell and Arthur Conan Doyle, which makes sense given that they spent a lot of their time here. I think my favorite thing that I've seen in the archives of Conan Doyle's is one of his student notebooks. And in the front of the notebook is the notes that he's taking studiously in the lecture. And when you turn it round in the back, he's written one of his earliest stories, The American Tale.
So yeah, the archives here are very rich in history and extremely useful for my research because they include Joseph Bell, Henry Duncan Littlejohn, and of course Doyle. And one of my favourites from his archive is the letter in which Doyle himself credits Joseph Bell as the influence for Sherlock Holmes. He writes, "It's certainly to you that I owe Sherlock Holmes." And the archives would be very nice to let us put that on display in the museum.
So I mean, that's kind of remarkable to be the man who inspired Sherlock Holmes, which at that time, the character of Sherlock Holmes became pretty famous, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And there's really no denying that Joseph Bell was very like Sherlock Holmes. everything from his observation, deduction, and analytical skills. So Joseph Bell used to entertain his students by telling them stories about diagnosing patients before they even opened their mouth. And he kind of insisted on those skills to his students. And even if you look at pictures and portraits of Bell, he's very Sherlock-esque.
And do we know if Bell was flattered, horrified?
I think he found it quite amusing. I believe he used to tell people he was the influence for Sherlock Holmes. And we know from the archives that towards the end of his career, he was actually writing to Conan Doyle with ideas or stories with some of the medical breakthroughs that were happening here in Edinburgh.
God, that's fantastic. I mean, it's a pretty good dinner party chat, right? To be the person who inspired a very significant character.
But I think there was also others that inspired Conan Doyle. There must have been, because there were so many medical characters here in Edinburgh, particularly the trailblazers in medical jurisprudence, because Edinburgh really was the birthplace of forensic medicine in Scotland, if not the whole of the UK.
So you just used a phrase, medical jurisprudence. What is that?
So medical jurisprudence was the forerunner of both public health and forensic medicine. The first chair in the UK was established here in Edinburgh in 1807. It also involves the medical witness. So in Scottish courts, a witness, like you or I, if we were called to court, can only talk in facts. So what we saw, where we were, what we heard. But an expert witness, which also counts the medical witness, because they have expertise in a certain area, they can give their opinion based on the evidence. And the medical witness, kind of prior to the 19th century, wasn't really well regarded in court. They couldn't offer much, but thanks to the medical men here in Edinburgh, they really kind of established the expert witness. And I think there were probably 3 medical jurisprudence experts who could have potentially influenced Doyle, and they would be Robert Christensen, Douglas McLachlan, and Henry Duncan Littlejohn.
Fantastic. So let's start with Robert Christensen.
Yeah, so he's very much credited by historians as being the man who established the medical expert witness in Scottish courts. He took over the chair of medical jurisprudence in 1822. At that time, it was in the law department. It wasn't compulsory for medical students. By the time he gave up the chair in the 1830s, it was now a compulsory component of a medical degree. So he very much kind of helped establish it there. I think his greatest role was his abilities in court. He was very honest, he never speculated, and he managed for the first time to put very complex medical evidence in layman's terms for the jury. And I think that helped kind of establish him as the Crown's main witness, so they often called him on him. In fact, he actually started out for the defence, and I think he was so good that the Crown said, come on our side. But he was so honest that he would often tell the Crown, I don't think you've got a case, I won't appear for you. And we know he must have been an influence for Sherlock Holmes because he is present in the very first Sherlock Holmes novel, A Study in Scarlet, where we are introduced to Sherlock through a character describing him to Dr. Watson. I don't know if you are happy to read out that section.
I have this book here. I'm just going to lean down and get it. So the character is Stamford, and he's describing Holmes's unsettling experiment. And he says, when it comes to beating the subjects in the dissecting rooms with a stick, it is certainly taking a rather bizarre shape. Beating the subjects? Yes, to verify how far bruises may be produced after death. I saw him at it with my own eyes.
So that experiment comes directly from one of the most famous trials in Scottish history, and probably the darkest moment in Edinburgh's medical history, and that is, of course, Burke and Hare.
Incredible. So Christensen did that?
So the trial of Burke and Hare in 1828, Christensen was called in to examine the medical evidence and do the post-mortem. Burke and Hare's last victim, so they murdered 16 people in order to supply cadavers for medical teaching, and their last victim, Margaret Docherty, was discovered. They managed to transport her body to the anatomy labs, and there she was discovered by the police. So Christensen is called in, he examines the body, he sees that there is bruising on the legs, he sees there's a broken bone in the neck, but he's convinced that these injuries were caused after death, but at that time, he didn't have a way to prove it. He saw there was a slight bruising around her mouth, and he was convinced that she had been suffocated, but he couldn't, again, prove how that happened. So what he does is exactly what Sherlock does. He beats cadavers in the anatomy rooms at various stages after death and proves for the first time that a type of bruising called postmortem bruising can occur after death, and proves that the bruising on Margaret Docherty's body and the broken neck did not cause her death. They happened after her death. And they happened after her death because Burke and Hare transported her body in a small tea chest and had to force her legs and her head into the tea-chest, which broke the bone and bruised the body. The suffocation, whilst Christensen couldn't prove it in a medical stance, what happened in the Burke and Hare trial was they knew they wouldn't be able to prosecute both men, so Hare turned King's evidence against Burke, which meant he could talk about his involvement in the crimes without any form of prosecution, and the way he described the murder method matched Christensen's evidence, which gave corroboration. So their murder method was to ply their victims with drink so they could not defend themselves. When they were asleep, one would lay across the body to prevent any fight back, which is why there was no form of self-defense wounds, and the other would cover the nose and mouth of the hand, causing the victim to suffocate them. So Christensen's evidence helped prove that, and it also probably stopped future miscarriages of justice because now we fully understood post-mortem bruising.
What an incredible discovery. So the time between Christensen discovering this and Conan Doyle writing his first book, it's quite close.
Not so much. So Christensen discovered that in 1828. Conan Doyle didn't go on to write till much later in the 10th century, but obviously that case was so famous and Christensen's write-up of it inspired Doyle. And no doubt Doyle was learning this in his medical jurisprudence classes that he was taking at the extramural school and also at the university.
So for the public at the time reading these stories, though, it would have felt like relatively new, fresh.
Absolutely. Sherlock also had a brilliant ability of being the one that discovered everything, if you believe the books.
So we have Christensen, who feels like he's on the cutting edge of these new discoveries. How else was he similar with Sherlock?
I think personality-wise, he certainly was. Yeah, Christensen's definitely a very confident character. But also, you can see from Sherlock's experiments with poisons, that was Christensen's kind of key strength, if you will. So he actually went on to write a book on the treatise of poisons. In one very famous trial, the Madeline Smith trial in 1857, one of the key arguments between the prosecution and the defence was that Madeline couldn't have poisoned her lover using arsenic because it had such a strong taste that her lover would have tasted it if he was drinking it in something like coffee or cocoa. What the defence argued was, that strong taste, he would have tasted it and said no. What Christensen argued for the prosecution was, contrary to popular belief, arsenic didn't have that strong a taste, and he proved it by putting it on his own tongue effectively, put it as far back in his mouth as he dared to try and taste it. And he said, if you mix that in something very strong like coffee, there's no way you would taste arsenic.
Is this in the courtroom?
This is in the courtroom.
Wow.
He didn't taste it in the courtroom, but he used his own experiments to kind of emphasise that the defence didn't have an argument. Fortunately for Madeline Smith, Christensen's case wasn't successful in that case and she was found not proven.
Wow. I mean, was that bravery or madness to taste arsenic like that?
Probably a bit of both. But it probably helped future convictions now that misconception was corrected. And as I say, he published that treatise on poisons in 1829, and that book was in continuous use well until the 20th century.
So poisoning was pretty common at that time?
Yes, so I call poison the murder weapon of choice of the 19th century. It was difficult to prove, difficult to spot. So many doctors missed key symptoms of poisoning because they mimicked so many other natural diseases and causes. So every trial I look at in the 19th century, pretty much, the victim has already been buried and with the death signed off as something else before it's reinvestigated due to circumstantial evidence. It was so cheap to buy, so everyone always calls poison, especially arsenic, the inheritance poison, but actually it was probably used by the kind of middle and lower classes more. Because it was so difficult to prove in court, most trials were being found not proven. It was easy to buy, it didn't require any strength, so a lot of women used poison as a murder weapon. Divorce was difficult, so it was a way out of a very unhappy marriage. And lastly, the biggest killer of the 19th century, life insurance had came into play, so it was a good way to make money. Also, if you were an unhappy married woman, you could not only get divorced, but you could also get life insurance to start up your next life. So very, very difficult to prove. But as we move into the 19th century, the later 19th century, medical evidence is beginning to improve, both with identification techniques, but also, as I said, the way these kind of medical men are performing in court, that some of these trials are starting to be found guilty. And I think two men that helped that greatly are Douglas McLachlan and Henry Duncan Littlejohn.
Gosh. So, Louise, you used the phrase not proven, which is typical to Scots law, yeah?
Yes, so it's a very unique Scottish verdict. So in Scottish courts, you can be found not guilty, where there's not been enough evidence to prove that you've committed the crime. You can be found guilty, so beyond all reasonable doubt, the jury believe you've done it. And not proven, which in kind of basic terms is we don't believe it's been proven, but we don't want to find you not guilty. So it doesn't really clear your name, so a lot of people don't like not proven, but you do not receive any punishment, so you walk free.
Gosh, you've just got it hanging over your head.
Hanging over your head. So it's used a lot in poison cases because sometimes, the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming, but because it's not been medically proven or vice versa, not proven is used a lot. But as I say, towards the end of the 19th century, we do see the not proven being used less in poison cases because new identification techniques are coming in, and really because the men who are appearing in the witness stand as the expert medical witnesses are being able now to give kind of complex information to juries in a way that they understand. And I think two men that helped that greatly is Douglas McLachlan and Henry Duncan Littlejohn. So Doyle, like all medical students, would have studied under Douglas McLachlan because he was the longest serving medical jurisprudence lecturer. Well over 30 years in that chair. He became, like Christensen, the Crown's main medical witness. He was an expert in toxicology. But I feel for him because I think he was overshadowed by both his predecessor and his successor. His successor being Henry Duncan Littlejohn. So because McLachlan held that chair for so long, Henry Duncan Littlejohn taught at the extramural school for many, many years, where Conan Doyle must have taken his class because Henry Duncan Littlejohn's classes were so popular. But Henry Duncan Littlejohn is slightly different from Christensen and McLachlan because he made medical jurisprudence his main topic. So he also focused on public health, but he was also what's known as a police surgeon.
Wow, a police surgeon. So first of all, I love the idea of his lecture theatres just full of students. He must have been an amazing sort of storyteller.
Apparently he was such a good lecturer, and he used to take his students out to crime scenes and he would talk about his own involvement in trials. So a very, very, very good teacher.
Well, and a police surgeon.
And a police surgeon. So yeah, I think he's probably the closest the world ever got to a real life Sherlock Holmes, because through his role as police surgeon, he would have been not only attending to the health of police officers, but he would have been conducting all post-mortems, overseeing all the executions, and importantly, being called out to accidents, both to provide medical aid and to also help investigate murders. And there's a great example of how far medical forensics had come by this point, but also involving both Douglas McLachlan in his role and Henry Duncan Littlejohn in his role as police surgeon. And that is the Eugene Chanté trial of 1878.
Tell us more about the Chanté trial.
Yeah, so Chanté was actually someone Doyle knew. So Doyle he was a French teacher. He was French himself, and he became a French teacher. He was a failed medical student, Chanté, and taught French at Conan Doyle's primary school. So I'd imagine Conan Doyle followed this trial with great interest. So Chanté married one of his students who was only 15 when they married, and they'd been married 3 months when she gave birth to her first child at 16. So I think today it would very much be a case of grooming. Then it was a marriage of necessity. It was a very unhappy marriage. She had reported him to the police on numerous occasions, and he insured her life and his in the November. And on New Year's Day, Madame Chanté became very, very ill, went to bed, and in the morning the maid got up. She went to check on Madame Chanté. She found her in bed. She had vomited on herself. She was moaning, but she couldn't wake her up. So she ran to get Chanté. He came into the room, and he said to the maid, "I need you to go check on the children," even though they'd both just come from the children's room. She left the room, and when she came back in, Chanté was returning from the window and said, "Do you smell gas?" And only then did the maid realise she could smell gas. And this is where Henry Duncan Littlejohn comes into play. So Chanté was convinced by the maid and the children to call for a local doctor. When that local doctor heard that this could be a coal gas poisoning case, he thought that would interest Henry Duncan Littlejohn as a public health officer. So he called Henry Duncan Littlejohn to the scene. So when Henry Duncan Littlejohn comes in, he sees straight away that Madame Chanté's dying. He's very concerned with her, sends her off to the Royal Infirmary, where she is cared for by none other than Douglas McLachlan. He takes one look at her, smells her breath, touches her skin, and turns to his student and said, "This is not a coal gas poisoning case. This is a poisoning case. It's either morphia or opium." So he immediately calls it as suspicious. Sadly, Madame Chanté passes away after a couple of hours of being cared for at the Royal Infirmary, and a post-mortem's ordered because naturally both Henry Duncan Littlejohn and Douglas McLachlan know that something is not right. At that post-mortem, they find no evidence of coal gas poisoning, They find no evidence of opium in her system, and they find no causes of natural death. What they do is they test the sick that was found on her bedclothes, on her nightgown, and in the sick there is strong evidence of opium.
Gosh.
So the case goes to trial. Of course, the defence makes a big deal about the fact there was no opium found in her system. Now, I would imagine if that trial had been 20 years earlier, it would have been immediately found not proven, because juries really need to see the poison in the body. But both McLachlan and Littlejohn expertly explain away why opium wasn't found. It's very common not to find opium, they both say, because it breaks down so quickly in the body. They would be very surprised, given the fact how long Madame Chantel survived, to find opium in the body. But the fact that it's in the sick indicates that it's what she ingested and is the cause of death. They both also completely disclaim the coal gas poisoning. They say, in order for Madame Chantel to have been killed by coal gas poisoning, one, they would have found evidence in her body, but two, it potentially would have killed the entire family. And there's no way, in their opinion. And it was very strong evidence they both gave, particularly Littlejohn. He said, I think it was almost impossible that the maid could have woke up, walked through the house, walked into her room without smelling coal gas poisoning, had it been enough to kill Madame Chantel. So Chantel is found guilty. He is enraged by this. He says he didn't get a fair trial, that his defence wasn't good, that he's been framed. But he can never really explain who would frame him. He also can't explain where the pipe was broken, was beside the window where he was seen walking away. That pipe had broken months before and he himself had overseen the repairs. And he can't explain why that pipe was broken in the first place. So it's very, very interesting. Whether or not he perhaps accidentally poisoned his wife and tried to cover it up, we don't know. But the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. She had written to her mother saying, if he ensures my life, I'm dead. She had said, I would never leave my children, and she had endured years of abuse because she didn't want to leave her children. So a lot of the times the defence would go to suicide. Mm-hmm. Suicide was a crime at that stage, very disrespected. So they went to suicide, but it was proven that she would never leave her family. She endured months of abuse. Why would she suddenly leave now? And also she had said that Chantel had threatened to kill her in a way that even the medical detectives of the time would not be able to prove.
And he'd said that?
He had said that to her, and she had written it in a letter to her mother. So it kind of showcased Chantel's arrogance, that he thought he could get past these medical detectives, also how famous they were.
Yeah.
That this is kind of what he was thinking. Interestingly, apparently he said just before he was executed, because Henry Duncan Littlejohn, of course, had to be there to oversee that. Apparently he said, give my regards to Joe Bell, he certainly did a good job of bringing me here. But I can find no evidence that Joseph Bell was involved in that case. But very, very interesting, unless he was maybe consulted behind the scenes.
Or he's speaking more broadly to these men who undertake this body of work. It's interesting, though, in the trials, the circumstantial evidence coming in as well. So we have the sort of medical scientific evidence alongside circumstantial evidence. So there's still a willingness or a need for the jury to hear all of these things together.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, as I say, these trials were very difficult to prove. Juries really wanted an eyewitness to poisoning trials, which doesn't happen. It's a secret crime. So I think prosecutions relied on having strong medical evidence alongside a lot of circumstantial evidence.
Okay. So back to Joseph Bell then. Was he involved in any criminal investigations or trials?
It's interesting. I've only ever found one trial that he was involved in. It's a very interesting trial. It's the Ardlamont trial of 1893. It's actually a gunshot trial. So one of the few gunshot trials that I've seen. That centred on a man called A.J. Monson, who was on trial for the murder of his student, Cecile Hambra, who had been found with a fatal gunshot wound to the head whilst out shooting on the Ardlamont estate, which is just outside Glasgow. It's an interesting case in the sense that they brought in so many medical expert witnesses. We start to see gun experts brought in. Patrick Heron-Watson's brought in as a military surgeon who comes in to kind of talk about gunshot wounds. We see James McNaught brought in as a gun expert. So a very kind of different case, almost the forensic medicine we'd expect to see today.
Patrick Heron-Watson? So we have a military doctor? Surely. Is that our Dr. Watson?
I think it's got to be Dr. Watson. I've never seen anything where Conan Doyle credits him as being the influence behind Dr. Watson, but he is so similar. So he was a strong advocate for women in medicine, and Dr. Watson in the books is a lot nicer to women than our Sherlock is. He was a military doctor, just like Dr. Watson is in the books. He also worked under Joseph Bell. So he was kind of with Joseph Bell on the wards. So very similar. But yeah, sadly, Conan Doyle's never actually credited him at all.
The other, sorry, just while I think of it, the other thing I love in the archives is Dr. Watson's notebook.
Yes.
So this is his student notebook from when he's attending lectures, and he's doodled skeletons fighting with swords.
Having a duel.
Having a duel. The dueling skeletons. Love it.
Absolutely.
Back to the case.
Back to the case. So yeah, I mean, they all give very strong evidence that, in their opinion, in Watson's own words, he says, I have not been able to make out any way by which the injury could have been done either designedly or accidentally by Hamber himself. So when Cecile's shot, Scott and Monson come back to the estate, they empty and clean the gun that they had, and then they send the staff out to get Cecile's body, bring him back to the house. A local doctor comes, sees a gunshot wound to the head, agrees it's accidental, and Cecile is buried.
Okay.
Then 2 weeks later, an insurance claim is put in by Monson on Cecile's life insurance claim, and the insurance company come to investigate. They're not happy because that insurance policy was only taken out 2 weeks before Cecile's death.
Ooh, yeah.
And it's been made out to Monson's wife.
Okay.
So when they come to investigate, they alert the procurator fiscal, who send Little John to do a post-mortem, and he says, there is no way this is suicide or accidental, this has to be murder. The problem was, the defence called in Matthew Hay, who was Little John's equivalent in Aberdeen, and Hay and his team argued the absolute opposite. So they say it is accidental. He could have shot himself in the head with a shotgun while falling forward. The prosecution team argue that's completely impossible. He was shot at a distance due to the angle of the wound, etc. So I think what you have is a very confused jury. If you've got two medical witnesses who both have the exact same credentials saying the exact opposite, I think almost it cancels out the medical evidence itself. So what we come to is the circumstantial evidence. So the defence argue, and it's very interesting, that in Scottish law, if you are under the age of 21 and you take out a life insurance policy on yourself, if you die before you get to the age of 21, it will automatically go to your parents.
Right.
So despite the fact that Cecile took out that life insurance policy and put it in the name of A.J. Monson's wife, it would never have went to her because he was under 21 at the time.
Right.
The defence argue, and I think it's a bit of a stretch, that A.J. Monson knew this unique Scottish law, despite the fact that he was English, and he decided just to put in the claim anyway. So he would never in his right mind murder Cecile because he knew that he would not get the insurance, and he just put in the insurance to try and get away with it.
Okay.
The prosecution obviously argued that's rubbish. He clearly didn't know about the 21 law, and he tried to murder Cecile in order to gain the life insurance. Interestingly, he's found not proven, and I think it's because the defence put a lot of emphasis to the jury that this is a man's life on the line. So if you have any doubt, they say, don't find him guilty. Interestingly, Monson was infuriated by being found not proven. So even though he had no sentence, he very much viewed this as almost like a shadow hanging over him, and argued in the press that had he been tried in England, he would have been found not guilty. I think that's a stretch. I think there's every chance he could have been found guilty in England because you didn't have that not proven barrier. But anyway, he walked free and was not found.
It's interesting, the life insurance going to motive. I mean, these are episodes of CSI today, right? Like that narrative in life and in fiction is so real.
So real. It's very, very interesting. And I think the not proven verdict can help prevent miscarriages of justice when juries are on the fence. Sadly, it was not always used. So one of the worst cases in Scotland was the Oscar Slater case. And again, Conan Doyle was involved in this. So Oscar Slater was accused and convicted of murdering an 82-year-old woman called Mrs. Gilchrist in her home in Glasgow in 1908. There's so many things wrong with this case that it was actually used later by Glasgow to introduce new police cadets on how not to investigate a murder.
God.
To start with, kind of major facts are not included in the trial. So after Mrs. Gilchrist was murdered, Slater was found trying to board a ship to America. But what they didn't include in the trial was that he had booked that passage 2 months before the murder.
Right.
So they tried to make it look like this was his escape. The big problem, and the one that Arthur Conan Doyle wrote about, I mean, he actually helped free Oscar Slater eventually, was that Mrs. Gilchrist was so violently attacked that her face was barely identifiable. Her skull had been forced inwards with the kind of weight of the blows. And so everybody thought the murder weapon would have to be something big and heavy. And when Oscar Slater was found, he had a very small hammer, almost like a small like jeweler's hammer, in his possession. And everyone said that was the murder weapon.
Right.
And Conan Doyle said that's impossible to inflict that much damage. The medical evidence in this case was also a big problem. So there was microscopic yellowish stains on the hammer and on the coat that Slater had. The medical witness that was called in was, again, very much like Little John in the sense he was Glasgow's equivalent. He was Professor John Glaister. And this was long before blood tests existed, so there was no way to prove that it was human blood. However, Glaister was confident from his own experience that the marks on the hammer and the coat were blood. And I think one of the most damaging sentences in the case was the judge, for some bizarre reason, said, if a man's life wasn't on the line, would you say this was blood? And Glaister said yes. But the point is that there was a man's life on the line.
Absolutely.
So really, it was such a horrible case. It should have been found not proven. But he was found guilty. And really, a lot of it was racial discrimination towards Slater. He has a bit of a kind of unsavory lifestyle as well, which didn't help in the press. Also, he was put in a lineup with something like 7 off-duty police officers who looked nothing like him. So he was found guilty, and he actually endured 19 years of hard labour in Peterhead Prison. And I have been to Peterhead Prison recently. They've got a lovely museum up there now, and just showcase how horrible that must have been. And it was really down to the campaigners like Doyle that set him free after 19 years.
So Doyle's campaign to set him free, was that writing articles and papers? How did he do that?
Yeah, so he actually kind of rewrote the trial, so kind of represented the evidence and kind of got the news out there and kind of kept it in the papers, and that's how he helped secure his release.
So he really stuck his neck out for Oscar Slater. Was that common for him? Was he looking for justice sort of outside of fiction too?
Yeah, so he did it a couple of times. There was another case down in England which he also helped correct a miscarriage of justice, and also really helped to establish a court of criminal appeal in England to help prevent future miscarriages of justice.
That's fantastic. So his work literally helped inform the Court of Appeal, or create it?
Yes.
Phenomenal. So what you've described, it sort of feels a little bit like a kind of Sherlock effect, where we have this desire to have this hero expert that has all the answers.
Yes, and we have it today still. So it's called the CSI effect today. So we're so used to watching these programs where one medical man or a team of medical people will, do a post-mortem, they'll do all the chemical tests, they'll investigate and speak to witnesses and solve the crime, and then be able to stand up in trial and say, I know for a fact what happened. And I think that's what juries are looking for, but the problem is that doesn't exist. However, there are problems when we look at the early 20th century where one man in particular almost starts to believe his own hype. And that's a man called Bernard Spilsbury, who was an English forensic investigator, a pathologist. Brilliant man, did a lot of good, but towards the end of his career, it is believed that there was a couple of trials that he was involved in, and that due to his evidence, there was a miscarriage of justice. And again, it's kind of like he was starting to see himself as a Sherlock that could solve these crimes. And one of the cases, he was only involved in one case up here in Scotland, and that was the Donald Merritt case in 1926. Donald Merritt was in the room alone with his mother, and she was shot in the back of the head. She was taken to hospital as a suicide victim, where she was actually seen by Joseph Bell, and she survived for 2 weeks. She was treated as a criminal because suicide was illegal, so she wasn't allowed to see anyone. She wasn't really kind of spoken to by the police, but the nurse remembers her saying, what did Donald do? He's such a naughty boy. Did he do this?
Right.
So it's clear the evidence that she did not commit suicide. The problem was Henry Duncan Littlejohn's son, who succeeded him as the forensic investigator, had signed off on it as suicide.
Mm-hmm.
He hadn't really investigated and seen, he had actually done a very brief postmortem on her and signed off as suicide. After all the circumstantial evidence came out, so Donald Merritt was effectively forging his mother's name months and months before she died, had buried into her kind of fortune. A proper postmortem was ordered and the case was opened. And Little John and Glaister from Glasgow did a postmortem and kind of came to the conclusion that this was murder.
Mm-hmm.
So they were already working from a kind of negative standpoint, and we were going to have a hard time proving to the jury why they'd changed their minds. But effectively, lots of things were clear in this case. So she was shot from behind. Not many people commit suicide by shooting themselves from behind the ear. There was gunshot residue. There was no gunshot residue on her skin, which would indicate the gun was quite far away when it was fired. So Glaser and Littlejohn did experiments with the same gun that was used in the crime and the same bullets, and they proved that had she shot herself from a close distance, there would have been significant gunshot residue burned into her skin, which there wasn't. Bernard Spilsbury down in London was called in by the defence. He does experiments with a different gun and different bullets, finds completely different evidence, and says, no, she definitely shot herself. On the stand, he says what had happened was the reason there was no gunshot residue found on her skin was when she was taken to hospital, the wound was bleeding so much that it wiped it off.
The blood wiped it off. Wow.
Which is almost impossible when gunshot residue is burned into the skin. Joseph Bell was called to give evidence because he was the doctor that attended to her. And he said, I saw no gunshot evidence. And there was also very little blood because that type of wound didn't bleed too difficult. Bernard Spilsbury was on the stand and the prosecutor says to him, you are speculating as to what's happened. So he knows that he's going too far effectively and he's trying to, and he says, no, I think it is almost certain that that is what would happen, which is an unbelievable thing for a medical expert to say, given the fact he wasn't there. And given the fact that Joseph Bell is a fantastic physician, I'm sure he knew exactly what had happened.
And had actually examined her.
So this is a case of Bernard Spilsbury very much believing in his own ability, refusing to accept that he got it wrong. He refused to accept that the fact that his experiments with a different gun and different bullets is any less than the experiments with the real gun and bullets. And the defence puts such emphasis on his name. So they say, I do not hesitate to say there is no name in Britain. There's no name in Europe on medical legal questions on the same plane as Sir Bernard Spilsbury. So they're kind of saying this man must know what happened. And sadly, Noel Merritt was found not guilty or not proven. And about 10 years later, he killed his wife and his mother-in-law before turning the gun on himself.
Gosh. So it's so interesting to think about Robert Christensen, if we go back to the beginning, or to the much earlier phase of medical jurisprudence, where Christensen was very much, this is some evidence, some facts that are part of a bigger picture. So that Sherlock effect has not kicked in the same way.
Yes.
But then once we come to Bernard Spilsbury, this idea of, I am a brand, I am believable, I am the expert. So within that period, that shift that's taken place.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Christensen was such an honest witness. And as I said, in this sort of case, he probably would have said, you know, I don't want to be a witness. I don't agree with what your argument is. But Spilsbury, I think, just started to believe in his own hype. And because he had solved some amazing crimes in his day, what Sidney Smith goes on to say, who was a later 20th century forensic expert, said the slackness of the police and credit given to misleading evidence of Spilsbury, who had made a mistake and was too stubborn to admit it, allowed Merritt to live and to kill again. And I think that summarises it very, very well. I say what the change was after this event and leading into the 20th century, we see forensic medicine starting to break down to what we know it today. So we now have forensic pathologists, toxicologists, crime scene investigators, and that corroboration that takes place ensures that it's no longer just one man's opinion. And importantly, there's no chance that you'd have one man swaying a jury again.
Yeah. So all of the checks and balances that we have now with groups of specialists working together.
Yes.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us today, Louise.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Knife, a medical history podcast brought to you by Surgeons Hall Museums, Library and Archives. To find out more about us, you can visit www.museum.rcsed.ac.uk. You can also follow us on our social media channels. Join us wherever you get your podcasts.